Now, all this week on Focus on Africa, we've been celebrating our 5th anniversary and revisiting some of the biggest stories that we've covered across the continent and the rest of the world. When this program launched, the aim was to bring balanced reporting of all issues across Africa, told by our very own reporters on the ground. So have we succeeded, and how has the reporting of Africa by the international media changed in the last 5 years? Well, joining me these issues and what big trends we can expect news-wise over the next 5 years are the economist Manji Cheto, who is a familiar face, political analyst Imad Mesdoua, who's also a familiar face on this program, and the author and founder of Nzinga Effect, which is a platform for telling African women's stories, Eliza Anyangwe. Thank you all for gracing our studio today. And before we start, I will give you each a minute and a half to just give us your views, 1-2 points on how the international media over the past 5 years has covered Africa, if it's positive, if it's balanced, and where we have missed the trick. Let me start with you, Manju.
I think it's getting fairer. I don't think it's perfect, but I do think we've had a lot of positive stories coming out of Africa, and I think in part that has been largely driven by Africans themselves actually calling out the media and saying we're tired of the negative press. You tend to highlight a lot of things that are negative, and I think I'll come back to this, but I think one of the big positives in the last 5 years is the deepening of democracy across Africa and citizen activism, which we've seen happening across the continent.
Imad?
Well, very similar to what Manji said. I think what's really changed is that we've gone from one extreme to the other. We've gone from Afro-pessimism for many years to Africa rising, and now really we're in a phase of what I call Afro-realism, in which the press and the media's coverage of Africa has become more realistic and more in touch with actually some of the issues that impact Africans. And as Manji rightly said, that's partly due to Africans mobilizing to have their voices heard and to make sure that the media are called into account, when they're talking about African issues.
Eliza, I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Nicked all the best points, no? I think I agree with both. I would start by dividing up where the optimism in the media is coming from. The news media largely remains unchanged. It still reports death, destruction, disease. And so the focus when talking about Africa is still very much through that lens. We saw just briefly your news headlines are death, destruction, and disease. So if somebody's only picking up those types of stories, that's all that they will see about Africa, which maintains the narrative of a continent that cannot govern itself, or even indeed this giant country, right? Because I don't think people's understanding of the differences between regions and countries has changed. I think our geographic understanding of what constitutes Africa still is sub-Saharan Africa. We class North Africa as a different region, different stories, different audience. And I think that when we look at positive stories, there has been some work in the international media.
So there have been some positive stories.
Absolutely.
So we've come some way really in the last 5 years.
But those will not be on the news programs. Those will be on supplementary programs where, or on additional coverage online, or even what the BBC Africa has done very well with using WhatsApp to tell stories and to build a community that way. Mm-hmm. But I think that the sort of bread and butter of news journalism, which is, the BBC, CNN, etc., continues to be a continent of death, destruction, and disease.
So we still have
changing, isn't it? I mean, I do think it is changing, and I have a lot of conversations with, people who work for these organisations, and the conversation I have a lot is actually a lot of Africans are calling us into account, and actually even a lot of these people are saying we need more Africans reporting African news, and I think, I am frustrated. It needs to change quicker, but it is starting to happen. So I like to be an optimist when it comes to these things, and I do see things actually changing.
All right, okay, so then let's move forward. The past 5 years, or let's say 5 years ago, there was this narrative that was brought up, the narrative of Africa rising. Yep. 3 years down the line after that, it appeared a myth of some sort. I would like you guys to predict the next 5 years, what the trends will be news-wise or across the continent.
Well, I think maybe from speaking quite broadly, one of the things that I think is likely to come about, or certainly I hope it comes about, is there'll be more focus on what Eliza was talking about, the nuance of the continent. So going beyond generalizations, going beyond very simplistic views of the continent. And you know, one of the reasons why that has to happen is because the issues are actually way too complex to be simplified. So if you look at an issue like terrorism, for example, security, sorry to be doom and gloom, but it's the kind of focus area that we face on the continent from a security perspective. A lot of the terrorism issues the continent face are actually very localized. You know, the agendas are localized, the actors are localized, as opposed to maybe international terrorism, where you see, you know, the presentation ideologically and the modus operandi is shared by groups across regions. In Africa, these issues very much are localized. So I'm hoping that that's something that's going to come about in the next few years.
Eliza, we have a huge youth base, and in the next 20 or so years, we'll be looking at a generation that needs to be considered and taken into account. How do you see that playing out in the next few years?
You know, I think that, well, before I answer that question, I just want to come back to this point that we're making, which is that my view isn't necessarily one of pessimism. My view is that the question, if it's with regards to specifically international media, change isn't being led by the international journalists. No. As a journalist myself, I've asked people to stop asking me to lead from outside. It's that actually your president, when Buhari gave his interview when he became president, that interview should have gone to local journalists, not to CNN.
President Buhari actually gave the interview to Focus on Africa's Peter Okwocha, you know that?
Well, that was the first one. Oh, fantastic. Well, good, because I thought his first interview was to CNN. But then, so just to talk then to the question of youth bulge, I think that the question of youth bulge is really important, because I think that these are young people who, there are far too many of them to be funneled into our main sort of employer sectors, which are, you know, government. So a lot of people are working in the informal sector. And I think that while there is a dissatisfaction that comes from the inability to convert your 2 degrees, your master's degree, into a job in the formal economy, there is also a connection with the world and an anticipation that Africans themselves will be doing and changing things. So if you look from culture perspective, African young musicians, African artists, they're not waiting for the world to officially give them permission to. They're forcing themselves into that space, and the rest of us are playing catch up.
So we'll be seeing a lot of that. Yes, that is actually technology, right? That's the main driver behind this. We have a lot of African youths that are engaging with social media, internet activities getting better across the continent. So actually you do have a lot of Africans who are now not waiting for people to report their own stories, but actually transforming the way that business, politics, culture is conducted in Africa. And for me, this is going to be the biggest theme for the next 5 years across Africa.
And revolutionize the continent. Yeah. You have coined a word, which is Afro-realism. Do you care to explain what that is?
Sure, I think it's, again, rather than generalizing the continent as a place with all the doom and gloom, you know, war, disease, hunger, or the Africa Rising narrative, which I think a lot of Africans would agree perhaps painted a picture that was perhaps too rosy, too optimistic about some of the challenges we face. Afro-realism is actually, you know, about the nuance, about looking at the granularity, looking at the good and the bad,
realistically,
but in a realistic manner.
You've coined a word, quickly, because we have 10 seconds.
Well, mine is an Afro-realism. It's Africans rising.
Africans rising,
yes, and what that
Africa rising
simply means is that Africans themselves will determine the course for the continent, and not some, you know, speculations in the market.
All right, Eliza, Imad, Manji, always a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you so much for coming to Focus on Africa. Thank you. Well, this is Focus on Africa from BBC World News with me, Sophie Ikenya.